This clip is brought to you by SaveWithConrad.com.
I'm curious, you talked about Scott Hall there, and a lot of people have sort of made that a wrestling legend that perhaps Scott Hall was the first guy to pitch the whole Crow look. Let's talk about Sting's involvement, though. How did he feel about the big change? I mean, obviously he had started to grow his hair out, and it was getting, it was his more natural color, dark hair, not the blue, or not the blonde flat top, but the longer, darker hair. That had happened ahead of this. Was that done with some sort of character change in mind? I mean, was that a deliberate attempt to change from Surfer Sting or just be more with the times? And then how did he feel about sort of moving away from the bright colors and now we don't talk and we're sort of monochrome?
It was really interesting, and Steve Borden, aka Sting, is a really he's a very smart guy, and he's very intuitive. He gets it, right? And again, going back to '96, when before Hulk Hogan and I sat down in his movie trailer in the middle of nowhere, California, talking about who was going to be the third man, and before Hulk threw his hat in the ring, or his headband, as the case may be, the third man was going to be Sting, because I thought Hogan was off the table. He had made it clear to me the year before that he had no interest in turning heel. He was off making a movie. He was happy doing his 4 pay-per-views a year for WCW because that's all he was contracted for. So he just, Hogan wasn't an option. It didn't even occur to me to ask him. And as a result of that, I went to Sting because I thought Sting would be the right guy. He was a longtime WCW, he was the hero. He was the ultimate babyface. He was our hood ornament. And Sting was, I know we've covered this before, but I think it's important since we're talking specifically about Sting to dig into it a little bit again. When I first went to Sting, he was, gosh, and you have to know Steve to really picture how this went, but Steve is, in some respects, he's a little bit like Hulk in that when you lay something out when I laid something out to Sting, he would sit and he would study. It's like he's listening to every word you're saying to, I think, partly, and this is just my impression, I don't know that this to be true, and I certainly don't want to speak for Steve Borden or Sting, but I would often get the impression that he wasn't going to be convinced unless he believed I was convinced. In other words, I think Sting had been in WCW for a long time. He'd been through a lot of bookers. He'd been through Dusty. He'd been through Kid Fry. He'd been through Bill Watts, Jim Ross. He'd been through it all, right? And heard a lot of stuff. Some of it good, some of it not so much. But I think with Steve, he didn't really start taking an idea seriously unless he felt the person pitching it was really, really excited about it. And sometimes, and you know this, Conrad, you work, you train, you teach people how to sell. You're a great salesman yourself. If you feel it and you believe it, the information that you share, the picture that you paint, whatever you're trying to accomplish, in a selling kind of position, is much more effective if you really, really believe in it or passionate about it, as opposed to representing it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And I think so many times in Steve's past, again, this is just me observing, from a distance. I think so many times in Steve's past, a lot of ideas were represented to him, but very few of them had the passion or the commitment behind it. So oftentimes I think Sting's process, much like Hogan's, Hogan would sit back and, kind of stroke that Fu Manchu and big old eyes kind of bore a hole through you, like he was listening to every word you say. What he was really doing is analyzing every word you said and looking for the weaknesses in the idea or the holes. In Hulk's case, he was always thinking 2 steps ahead. Okay, great. That's a great idea. Where does it go? And if you didn't have a where does it go from here answer, or the next step in the story or arc, as the case may be, you'd often, no matter how good the original idea was, you'd hit a brick wall. Well, Steve was very much like that, in the sense that he would analyze and hang on every word. He was very quiet. He didn't, as we're laying this idea out, especially when I was laying out Sting being the third guy, he was very, very quiet during, my first couple of go-arounds with him laying it out. And he got it. He knew. I think he also knew, because he was so intuitive. Sting knew that the surfacing character had run its course. It didn't mean it was dead. It didn't mean it wasn't successful. It's just nowhere else to go with it other than a fresh matchup. And sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes a character, especially one that's been successful for as long as Steve had been successful, the Sting character had been successful in WCW, with everything else changing around him, Sting being him, including the NWO, intuitively he knew, look, it's time. I love the Sting character. He was very secure in it. He was making a lot of money with it. He knew that the Sting character, the Surfer Sting as people refer to it, or I sometimes refer to it, was a very strong character. It wasn't going anywhere. But that was the problem. It wasn't going anywhere. It was in a good position. The character was in a good position, and it was important, but it really wasn't going anywhere. And Steve was smart enough to see that there were a lot of things going on that probably made sense to him to take that next step, which is why Sting was willing to turn heel and be the third man, because he saw the handwriting on the wall. He knew that he didn't know, just like the rest of us didn't know, that the NWO was going to be hugely successful. But even in the early stages of the NWO angle, when Scott Hall first came down in Macon, Georgia on May 27th, 1996, and interrupted, a match with Mike Enos and whoever Mike was wrestling, there was an energy and a buzz that no one had ever seen before, at least in WCW. That caveat, but he knew it, and he wanted to be a part of it. So I think by the time, now we're going to fast forward. Now we're talking about May 27th, 1996. Now fast forward to 1997, Sting's intuition was confirmed. NWO was hot as hell. Things were changing rapidly. The entire formula for baby faces and heels was turned on its head. Anarchy was at the core of most of the story regarding NWO, and it was believable, and people were a part of it. And by 1997, Sting, he had, to your point, he had started kind of evolving away from Surfer Sting, because the reality kind of approach to what we were doing, at least in our A stories, was so effective that Sting started, I think, on his own. He wasn't directed by me to start letting his hair grow out. I didn't tell him not to either. But that was all Sting, because he knew that his character had to evolve. All of them do. All characters have to evolve. And even in movie franchises, characters evolve. Even though they're successful characters, they have to evolve in the story and in the times. And Sting knew that. So by the time, Scott Hall and I and Kevin Nash and Hulk and maybe one or two others were sitting in a locker room somewhere right before Nitro, or a couple hours before Nitro. And thank God, Scott Hall was in one of his moments, was lucid. He was motivated. He was inspired. Inspired and motivated, I guess, is the same word, or same thing. But he was really passionate about this idea. And I think it was Scott Hall's ability and his passion for the Crow character that got Sting excited, for much the same reasons as I described before, because Sting was the kind of guy that would sit and really listen, not only to the idea, but the passion and the inspiration behind it, and how well you could paint that picture. And I found in my own experience, that when people would pitch me ideas, and I learned, from Hulk, and I learned from others who were legitimate, when I say legitimate, but I mean outside of wrestling, storytellers, people that have written and directed, blockbuster movies and have been involved in, episodic television outside of wrestling. And from my own experience producing television other than wrestling, how significant story beats are and passion and detail is and where things are going. And Scott, in that very inspired, lucid hour and a half or 2 hours that we probably spent discussing this new character, painted a picture that Sting, he was just drooling. He couldn't wait to launch this character. So there was no inhibition. There was no second, thoughts, or he wasn't doubting himself. Sting wasn't doubting himself or second guessing himself. The way Hall laid it out, the opportunity that character clearly had with its relationship to the NWO and how that story could play out. I mean, we were all just chomping at the bit to do it. Nobody more than Steve Borden.
How much influence did he have? Or, we've often heard sort of the creative process, at least from the way Bruce describes it, is they would sit around and say, hey, what if? Is Sting actively involved in that? Or is it more, he shows up, you guys tell him what to do, he goes and does it?
No, not Steve. Now, there were two Steve Bordens. There was the one, now this isn't fair for me because again, I didn't work closely with Sting, or not fair of me, I should say, not fair to me. It wouldn't be fair for me to kind of characterize Sting's involvement in his own creative prior to me getting involved with creative, because I wasn't a part of it.
Right.
So I don't know how active Sting really got in, with Dusty or Bill Watts or Jim Ross or anybody else that was booking or had an influence in booking at the time. I know with me, especially, in 96, 95 and 96, he was very active in it. Steve would come up with his own what ifs. And one of the things I love about Steve Borden as a person and working with him professionally is he could come to you with an idea and be excited about that idea. And if it didn't work because of timing or it didn't work for any reason, and you lay that out to Steve, it wasn't like, fuck, this place sucks. This booking sucks. You're not doing what I want to do, which I'm not saying, people were quite that animated and childish outwardly to my face or to the face of other people, whether it be Dusty or, Bill Watts or whoever. But oftentimes that's a reaction. That's the way people feel. And a lot of that has to do with how you tell them or how you explain to them why an idea won't work. But Steve wasn't that guy. It was like, if he came to me with an idea and the timing wasn't right for it or it just didn't fit or whatever, you listen, he laid it out, you'd explain it to him, and he was just as positive leaving the room as he was coming in. That's the kind of people I love working with, and that's why I love working with Steve Borden so much, because he was that guy. But as time went on, and once he jumped off, the cliff and wrapped himself in that Crow character, he was very involved in that. He would come up with a lot of ideas on his own, and he would be included in almost every discussion about the character, especially in the very, very beginning. So yeah, he was very for the first 6 months or so, he was very, very involved and very motivated.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.